My name is Jeff Abramson. I'm a senior fellow at the Center for International Policy and also manage something called the Forum on the Arms Trade. This gathering is meant to give reporters a chance to learn a little bit more about what a number of us are seeing collectively regarding the conflict in Israel-Gaza, Palestine, especially around the arms that are being provided into the conflict, as well as some of the calls that are being made by members of civil society and other findings. This is on the record. After the event, I will process a recording, and the audio recording will be sent around. So don't worry too much about how you look. You're not going to be shared that video. But also, if you do quote people, please quote them and their organization if they have one. Don't quote each other as members of the media. I want the media to feel free to speak as they wish. And I think that will lay out the ground rules. I will use the chat at times. You are also welcome to use the chat as different speakers are speaking. I may put some resources that they have created along the way. And thanks so much for joining in. What I will do is as the speakers speak, I'll give a very sense of their title, and I've asked each of them to speak for no more than 3 to 4 minutes, and then we will turn to questions. First up is Josh Paul, who I would call an independent expert at this point. Many of you do realize he is a former director in the State Department Office of Congressional and Public Affairs within the Bureau of Political and Military Affairs. And Josh, the question I've asked you to take on very briefly is why you felt the need to resign from that position, and any specific arms transfers you're now seeing that are of particular interest. And Josh has recently put out a brief on, and I will put that in the chat through the Institute of Middle East Understanding. But Josh, over to you, please.
Sure, thank you. Thank you very much, Jeff. And thank you as well to my co-panelists from Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and Churches for Middle East Peace. I'm not going to dwell on my story. As most of you are aware, I resigned out of concern that US weapons are being provided directly into a context where they are being used to kill thousands of innocent civilians, and in support of a policy that has not provided security either to Palestinians or to Israelis, and also because there was no interest in the administration or in Congress in pausing for even a moment to discuss those concerns. I don't believe it would be appropriate for me to discuss the specific arms transfer requests we received from Israel before I left, other than those which are now public due to their notification to Congress, such as the SPICE bomb kits that were notified on October 31st. So I'll leave it to the other panelists to address some of that. But generally, let me just say that my concerns split into 4 areas. First, that we are providing and being asked to provide munitions that are being used right now in Gaza, munitions that are killing thousands of civilians. Second, that we are setting aside in doing so, credible allegations of gross violations of human rights to arm specific units of concern within the Israeli security forces. Third, that there's a bit of a barn door context right now to Israel's requests, that I think recognizing increasing opposition within the US polity writ large, for example, in the 2021 joint resolution of disapproval that was introduced against a precision-guided munitions case for Israel, which was the first such effort by Congress to block an arms sale to Israel. The government of Israel is trying to get all it could need for the coming years, feeling that there is no political opposition and no opposition right now to those requests, and are even getting, I think, some things we might not have otherwise provided. And then fourth, that these concerns are all compounded by, as you've heard people up to the president and the vice president say, a lack of conditionality, as well as a refusal to use the significant amount of leverage we have to, for example, call for different approaches by Israel, to call for a ceasefire, as well as a basic inability, honestly, to see the humanity of the Palestinian people, particularly in Gaza. More broadly, while there is, in theory, a decent statutory and policy framework around arms transfers, as I've seen in my 11 and a half years in the State Department, it's a framework that affords too much flexibility, frankly, to the executive branch to override genuine and credible human rights concerns in the name of foreign policy imperatives. I've actually expanded on things Congress in particular could do to fill these gaps in a paper that Jeff just referenced, which was just released by the Institute for Middle East Understanding, IMEU, and which I'm sure they would be happy to provide to anyone on this call, and I think Jeff will put in the chat. And finally, let me just note that the current US approach to providing lethal arms to Israel is not just a moral failure, it's a policy failure as well. It has not led to peace or security for Palestinians or for Israelis. It is undermining the credibility of the US voice when it comes to speaking up on issues across human rights across the region and across the world. In fact, I understand from colleagues still in government that they have heard repeatedly from partners across the Middle East in the last couple of weeks that the US is undermining its credibility to speak up on human rights issues. And it also undermines our strategic competition with adversaries who do not share the values that we supposedly espouse when we apply those values selectively or hypocritically. So thank you very much. And after my co-panelists have spoken, I look forward to taking your questions.
Thanks so much, Josh, and thanks for sharing those insights. And I have put in the chat the report that Josh is talking about. I'll next turn to Sarah Yeager, who is the Washington director for Human Rights Watch. As many of you may know, Human Rights Watch has recently called for a suspension of arms sales into or arms transfers into the conflict more broadly. So I would ask Sarah to talk about why Human Rights Watch has come to that call and any other comments she would like to add. And I'll put that call in the chat now.
Thanks, Jeff. Please never let me go after Josh again or make me go after Josh again. That was very eloquent. Thank you. So yeah, Human Rights Watch has made the difficult decision. This is always a difficult decision for us in any conflict. We have only done so in a handful of cases to call for a suspension of arms into the conflict. And that is both to stop funding and transferring arms to Hamas and to stop funding and transferring arms to Israel. And that is because there are lots of different ways that organizations can go about this. And you're probably seeing from all the NGOs in Washington that everyone has a slightly different policy and a slightly different way of phrasing this. But for Human Rights Watch, it is about violations of international humanitarian law on both sides, and the risk that more violations of international humanitarian law that there is a risk that more violations will come to pass if they continue getting these weapons and continue on their current course. And so that's why we have called for a suspension of arms. Now, I want to say that under U.S. domestic laws and policies, and you've got a lot of resources there going into the chat, violations of the kind that we've seen, war crimes on both sides, which are serious violations of IHL, they would, in any other circumstance, I think, cause U.S. officials, both in the executive and in the legislature, to take another look at their security assistance and support for the warring parties or one warring party. But that kind of administration and congressional oversight has really been missing on Israel for decades. But certainly right now, we are not seeing a willingness to take a look at the provisions within domestic law and policies that would really create some sort of scrutiny around what is happening. There are, and Paul and others can go into this in far more detail, but there are several provisions within domestic law that would say, actually, we as the United States cannot be sending weapons at this point because of the violations that we are seeing, and they would certainly suspend for a period of time, if not place conditions. I've been particularly concerned about the no conditions on this security assistance and arms transfers. And that's something that Secretary of Defense Austin said within a couple hours of Israel basically saying that they were going to go into Gaza, is that we are not going to put conditions on this assistance. And for as much as we know, and I do believe that administration officials from Biden to Blinken to Austin are going to Israel, they are talking to their IDF and Israeli Authority counterparts and saying, we want you to abide by IHL. They are sharing lessons. They are, in some cases, having extremely tough conversations. What we're seeing from Israeli authorities is that they are not taking that on board. And so I don't necessarily expect that our calls for suspending aid will actually result in a suspension of aid, but I would hope that at this point in the conflict, the U.S. would put suspension of aid on the table as a threat or as some sort of leverage with their Israeli counterparts to course correct what they are seeing as either missteps or a intentional strategy that contains violations of IHL. And I will leave it there.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Next, I'm going to ask Amanda Classing, who is the National Director of Government Relations and Advocacy at Amnesty International USA. Amanda, I might have butchered your last name there. I'm sorry about that. But I have asked her to talk about some of the findings that Amnesty has had actually for years, particularly around deficiencies in advance warning. And I'll put some resources in the chat, but Amanda, over to you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jeff. So I will start with some of our findings in the specific case and then talk about our longstanding arms embargo call and what we currently are calling for. So Amnesty's published in the last few weeks its investigation into unlawful attacks. I'm focusing on the investigations related to the government of Israel because this call is focused on U.S. Advocacy embargoes. We do have extensive research looking at the war crimes perpetuated by Hamas. But in particular, in our investigations, we've highlighted several specific incidents that have led to civilian death where warning was defective. In each of those incidents, we detail the specific failings of the effective warning in each case. We've also issued specific concerns about the leaflets that the Israeli army dropped on northern Gaza on October 21st. And these leaflets ordered residents to immediately evacuate. Our analysis determined that the leaflets themselves do not constitute effective advanced warning, as they declare an entire region a military target and in a context where civilians have nowhere safe to go amid the relentless campaign of bombardments across the entire Gaza Strip. The leaflets also have to be read in the context of the Israeli army's initial broader evacuation order and the often repeated evacuation orders against hospitals located north of the Wadi Gaza line, and the conditions imposed by Israeli authorities on the entry of humanitarian aid and where it may be distributed. And our concern about these leaflets read in those contexts is that it indicates an intention to violate the principle of distinction by targeting civilians or civilian objects, or an intention to carry out indiscriminate attacks. And that may also provide evidence of efforts to forcibly displace civilians in northern Gaza. We've also investigated the use by the Israeli army of artillery shells that contain white phosphorus in military operations. We've done an investigation about the use in Gaza. We also have done follow-up investigations in the use of white phosphorus along Lebanon's southern border between October 10th and 16th of 2023. And we looked at a couple of attacks, and in one case, we were able to investigate it as call that it needs to be investigated as a war crime because it was an indiscriminate attack that injured at least 9 civilians and damaged civilian objects and was therefore unlawful. So how does that fit within our broader call on the arms embargo? Amnesty has had a long-standing call for a comprehensive UN Security Council arms embargo on Israel, Hamas, and other Palestinian armed groups. However, in the absence of a Security Council arms embargo, we're calling for states, including the United States, to immediately impose a comprehensive arms embargo on Israel, again, with the intention that the embargo stays in place until there's no longer a substantial risk that arms can be used to commit violations of international law and that there are effective accountability mechanisms in place. We've also called on states that are supplying arms to Hamas and other Palestinian groups to do the same. So our threshold is a substantial risk. We have general calls on topical weapons as well, such as cluster munitions and white phosphorus. But overall, our analysis is that the violations of international humanitarian law and potential war crimes continue unabated in this conflict, and therefore the U.S. has to suspend arms transfers to Israel. This is consistent with the Biden administration's own policy, which imposes a more likely than not standard, not a substantial risk, but very similar, more likely than not, in assessing whether U.S. furnished or authorized weapons will be used to commit or facilitate grave violations of or certain violations of international law. We also believe that the U.S. has a responsibility to suspend arms, and we also believe that they have knowledge that these arms may be used intentionally and to commit intentionally wrongful acts, which include crimes under international law, such as war crimes or crimes against humanity. And so continuing to transfer arms in that instance risks making the U.S. complicit in the outcome of the use of those arms. We're continuing our investigations of violations of international law by all parties, We have upcoming research that continues to support our conclusion that at this time, there continues to be a substantial risk of continuing violations of international law, and therefore, again, reiterate our call.
Thanks so much, Amanda. And I know before I turn to Reverend Dr. May Cannon that we are talking about people in Israel, in Palestine, in Gaza, and lives are matters. And, you know, we're talking about laws, but I think we all feel compassion and sorrow for the suffering that is occurring there. And I don't think any of us want that to get lost, which gives me a chance to turn to Reverend Dr. May Cannon, the Executive Director of Churches for Middle East Peace. As many of you have probably seen, the faith community in lots of different ways has been active on the fighting in Israel and Gaza. And I thought Reverend Cannon could talk a little bit about the work that she is doing and her colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff, and thank you to the other panelists. And I'm happy to answer questions. I just wanted to take a moment to explain Churches for Middle East Peace represents 34 denominations across all theological spectrums of American Christianity. So we represent millions of American Christians, Orthodox, Catholic, Protestant. I'm ordained in one of the few evangelical denominations that ordains women and peace churches. We've been around 40 years next year. And have been working on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict since we've been in existence. Our 34 denominations don't agree on many, many things, but we've come together around policy positions, particularly related to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We're committed to working to end the occupation of the Palestinian people, calling for an end to the blockade of Gaza. And in this situation, in terms of October 7th, all of our denominations have condemned all violence against civilians, the Hamas attacks on October 7th, but then also the collective punishment towards Palestinians of turning off water, gas, and electricity, and the indiscriminate bombing, which you all have been talking about, the weapons being used on civilians in Gaza. And so our denominational leaders actually just put out a statement today, which I will put in the chat in a few minutes, acknowledging the horrific consequences on civilians, including the more than 11 million deaths, you know, the more than 4.5 million children who have been killed. And while our denominations have different theologies as it relates to war, some of our groups are pacifists, some of our groups are just war groups, some of our groups adhere to theologies of just peacemaking. All of our groups have agreed to this particular war de-escalation and demilitarization has to occur to protect the lives of civilians, and particularly calling attention to the devastating impact of bombing on civilians in Gaza. You might be familiar. The Christian community in Gaza is very, very small. There's only about 1,000 Christians in Gaza, and many of the Christian infrastructure in Gaza has been utterly destroyed, including the St. Porphyrius Church, where 18 Christians were killed. And we care about the loss of all life, but I just wanted to call attention to the life of our communities there could be completely wiped out as a result of these effects. So our denominations have come together to call for a ceasefire, to call for immediate and adequate humanitarian assistance, and a release of hostages. My last comment is just that we do feel like Israel's response, that deterrence and further militarization is what will ultimately bring protection and security, is completely an ineffective strategy that ultimately leads to the death of more civilians and is devastating to Palestinians. There are other alternatives in terms of turning off water and gas and food. We believe constitutes ethnic cleansing, and we believe the only other alternative is to pursue peace. And so we're calling for a complete ceasefire and to demilitarization and to pursue peaceful means to resolve the current conflict.
Thanks so much, Reverend. As we have now had our speakers provide initial thoughts, feel free to raise your hand, reporters, if you would like to ask a question, or to put questions in the chat. As Sarah mentioned, there are Well, sorry, I was muted. I was just saying, as we've moved through our speakers now, feel free to raise your hand if you have questions. But as we're transitioning, I wanted to say that I have put in the chat that there are, as Sarah mentioned, a number of different organizations focused on broad or narrow pieces of work. I put in the chat a brief from Oxfam, which has taken a close look at 155 millimeter shells, which is of concern to them. So I want to make sure that that is people are aware of that. I would like to take first Bryant Harris, and then we'll go to Rachel Oswald. Bryant, go ahead.
Hi, thank you for doing this. I have three questions. One for Josh or any of the other arms control folks here. Can you, one thing that's been raised is a lot of our own laws aren't applied to Israel when it comes to law transfers. Can you point us to like where in the Leahy laws or Foreign Assistance Act we should be looking at for this question, and kind of compare it to how consistently those laws get applied to other countries? I also want to ask about the supplemental request, which was also in the House bill, of not notifying Congress on FMF transfers. Can you talk about what sort of impact that has, why that was included? And for the human rights folks here, I apologize because this is a very grim question, but in light of what we've seen, not just the indiscriminate bombing, but also the obviously the blockade of food, fuel, and stuff, the attacks on the hospitals. Assuming these conditions persist for the next several weeks, do you know like what sort of death toll we will be looking at when you start factoring in the spread of diseases, like people dying from starvation, dehydration, and that sort of stuff? Thank you.
Actually, begin on that. And hey, Brian, I'll caveat what I say by
just before you start, Josh, just because people are only going to get the auto recording, I'll make sure to say the name of the speaker so that in case people are going back to check quotes. So Josh Paul, please, go ahead. Okay,
thank you. So yeah, I'll caveat what I'm going to say by noting that I'm not a lawyer. And I would also point you to the paper that Jeff referenced that I released through the Institute for Middle East Understanding, IMEU, which is in the chat, which addresses some of this. But in terms of the legal frameworks, so the Leahy law for the State Department assistance is found in 22 U.S. Code 2738D. It requires that no assistance can be provided to a unit of a foreign security force where there is credible information that such a unit has committed gross violations of human rights. So this rests on a determination ultimately by the State Department that there is credible information that a unit has committed a gross violation of human rights. And in the current process, as it exists for Israel, no such determination has ever been made. There has been, in my view, plenty of credible information, but no determination has been made. Similarly, there is other language. I would point you to Section 502B of the Foreign Assistance Act, which states that no security assistance may be provided to a country, the government of which engages in a consistent pattern of gross violations of human rights. Again, here too, the law sort of rests on a determination being made, and there's nothing to force that determination. So I think the legal frameworks are there. The problem is that there are ways around them if you don't wish to abide by them, if you don't wish to apply them, and they are applied to other countries. I mean, Leahy vetting is applied globally where there is U.S. military ground assistance involved, and frequently results in both individuals and units being denied U.S. military assistance, whether that is equipment or training. Again, it is in the case of Israel that there have been many credible allegations in both my view and that of the human rights community within the State Department for which no determination has been made. And then on policy as well, you're aware, of course, of the conventional arms transfer policy, and Jeff referenced this in his opening, which notes that, or I think Sarah did, that there is no there is U.S. arms, the transfer of arms shall not be authorized, is what it says, when it is more likely than not that those arms will be used to commit human rights violations or to aggravate the risk of human rights violations. And I think there can be no question that the U.S. arms transfers to Israel in this context aggravate the risks of human rights violations, if not contributing to them directly, which I believe they also are. So in both cases, we're setting aside law, setting aside policy. Of course, policy is not binding to advance these weapons. And then quickly on your question about the supplemental request, yeah. So this is in my experience unprecedented. I understand that the State Department is now saying that this applies only to the notification of the grant assistance, not to the arms sales that are underneath it. That was not the discussion at the point at which I left the State Department, considering the exact same language. If they have shifted their interpretation, that is welcome, but it's still not enough. There is no reason for Congress to be denied the regular oversight of how US taxpayer dollars are being spent, particularly in this context. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Josh. Do any of the other panelists want to take on the
Well, yeah, I
suffering
can. I
question?
mean, it's a really difficult, and you're
Sorry,
right.
and this is Sarah Yeager for people listening to the recording. Go ahead, Sarah.
It's a really difficult and grim, you're absolutely right, question. Current estimates are 11,000 people have been killed, civilians, and over 3,000 of those have been children. I think what I'm hearing is that there are many thousands more who are disappeared, missing, buried under the rubble. They're still trying to get accurate estimates of all of the people who have been killed. So, this is orders of magnitude beyond what I have seen. I've been working in armed conflict for 20 years, and there are terrible armed conflicts around the world, but this has happened so quickly, and there are so many people dead so quickly. And what we're seeing now is, of course, the hospitals are shutting down. They began shutting down this weekend. Some of them contain thousands of people, 500 to 1,000, sometimes over that, who are not going to be able to get care, who will likely die. And then, of course, you're seeing, as the journalist mentioned, cholera, other diseases, safe drinking water, the fuel that people need to live, the aid that people need to live, all of it getting shut down, and supplies in really scarce amounts. So there is absolutely no way to put a number on this, but I think the horror that we are all feeling as we watch what is happening in Gaza is just going to compound in the coming days and is going to rapidly escalate.
Hi, thank you for doing this talk. So there's been a lot of talk about how countries in the global south oppose what's happening, the continued U.S. support for the IDF specifically. But I was wondering if the panelists could talk a little bit more about what other countries, I guess, besides the United Kingdom, think about what's happening. And then a second question, there's been some talk about how this current policy of deterrence and militarization is against Israeli interests long term. But can panelists talk a little bit about what this means for U.S. interests long term, about doubling down on this? Thank you.
Steph, I'd be happy to start if you like. Rachel,
great. Thanks, Sarah Yeager.
Rachel, nice to see. I think you were on the Council on Foreign Relations call this morning too. So nice to hear from you again. So in terms, let's see where to start. One of the things that we keep hearing from U.S. officials is that they're sharing the lessons learned from 20 years of counterterrorism operations with the Israeli Defense Forces. And my concern is that I think, and this goes to your question, I think they're probably sharing lessons that were actually not learned, or they're sharing the wrong lessons. Because my experience in those counterterrorism operations is that, in fact, ISIS was not defeated. Many civilians were harmed. The weapons that they used, the tactics that they used, were inappropriate for the situation. And in fact, the end result was far more anger and resentment around the world, which actually, of course, undermined their ultimate goal of national security. And so I think that lesson would be incredibly important to share with the IDF at this point, because while U.S. officials and Israeli officials consistently begin with the proposition that this is in self-defense and the right to self-defense, and I don't think that anyone would necessarily question that, the methods that they are currently using may in fact undermine their ultimate goal of safety, security, and legitimacy in the world. And so the way that I look at this is, particularly in answering legal questions, there's a can and there's a should. And, some of this is, a lot of the questions that we get is this illegal? Is it legal? But there's also the should. And I think, the IDF needs to reassess and course correct what its ultimate goal is and whether or not this is actually serving that ultimate goal.
This is May Cannon speaking. I think in response to what we're hearing from partners on the ground in the Middle East, and we have some staff in the Middle East as well, that right now, at least, many of the Arab countries are having non-violent protests in response to what's happening in Gaza, in response to, Israel's bombing, but then not only are the protests against Israel, they're also against the United States. And what we're hearing is that unless the bombing stops quickly, those nonviolent protests could very, very quickly turn to becoming violent, and that we have a very limited amount of time in terms of the United States reputation in the Middle East. Children and young people and the current generation, the perceptions of the way that the United States is understood around the world, but particularly in the Arab world, that there's a limited amount of time where we can preserve our reputation or save our reputation, because we are being seen as equally culpable with Israel for the bombing of civilians in Gaza. And so we have deep, deep concern about that. One, just that we want the number of deaths to stop, that it's a crisis and it's so urgent in that regard. But two, we've been, letting the White House and elected officials know we have deep concerns about the risk and the reputation of the United States in the Middle East, and the damage that is being done in that regard because of our weaponizing this conflict.
I would just jump in more generally.
This is Amanda, sorry, and then we'll go to Josh. Yep.
Oh, sorry, I didn't see his hand up. Just to say, outside of a national security context, in an administration that has focused on human rights as a part of their foreign policy and just thinking about the need for norms and a rules-based order, and the soft power that's required in order to advance human rights generally, the credibility question is significant, not just in the Middle East, but more generally to advance human rights in a variety of contexts. And so it will be lasting, the impact of destroying kind of the U.S.'s credibility on issues related to international law when it comes to the support that many civil society and human rights defenders and others need around the world to do their work. And so this is a broader context to consider.
And Josh, thank you, Amanda.
Yeah, thank you, Josh Paul. So a few quick things on that. First of all, in terms of the global war on terrorism, GWAT models, I think not only did the US not necessarily learn those lessons, but also some of them don't necessarily apply. And the example I would give you here, I was very involved, 20 odd years ago in the Battle of Fallujah. And I was responsible for reconstituting the Iraqi security forces before and after that battle. In Fallujah. And, one of the things the US did then was wait for a long time for the operation to begin in order to pull essentially or evacuate or encourage as many civilians as possible to evacuate out of Fallujah. And took a lot of criticism for it at the time that we were delaying the operation and that was allowing some of the combatants to escape as well. The difference here, of course, is the occupation and the memory of 1948 and the idea of evacuating people out of Gaza when there is a track record that they may not be able to go back. And I think that will be true in any combat operation the US has taken part in the global war on terrorism. We have never been in a situation where we have evacuated a town and people have felt that it will not be able for them to go back. So I think that's an important point to make. On other countries providing arms into this context, I would just refer you to open source reporting as regards not only the UK and the US, as you mentioned, but also countries including Australia, Canada, and Germany. And there, I'm sure, are others, but those are the ones I've seen credibly reported in the open press. And then on this question of impact on the global south, I think there are several aspects here, right? One that I've mentioned previously in public discussions is the notion that I think the Biden administration is right, that we are in a strategic competition with adversaries who do not share our values. And if the US position is that the most important tool in that is our alliances and our partnerships, then we may be undermining ourselves, because at the end of the day, what separates us from the competition is our values, or at least the values we say that we believe in. And I think that, that disrupts our credibility with global populations, not necessarily with autocratic governments, but with their people. And if we can't carry their people, what is the point? That is our edge. The second thing I think, and I do want to point out that there has been, and I've heard from a lot of people across American society, that they feel censored, that students are being doxxed when they speak out on this, that people are being fired from their jobs in law firms, in accountancy firms, in the media, in government, for speaking out on this issue. And, I have heard from officials within the US government. For example, I was speaking to one official in the last week who was describing meetings that they've had repeatedly with the ambassador of a foreign country, in which all of those previous meetings have been the US saying, you need to improve human rights, you need to stop democratic backsliding. And this time the ambassador came in and said, essentially, how dare you tell us about our freedom of speech when you don't have freedom of speech in America?
Thanks to all the panelists. And Rachel, I think we tried to take on the question in many different ways. I hope that was a helpful piece. I'll just say quickly as my hat for the Center for National Policy, the global reaction is diverse, and it is, I think you can see the United States is out of step with the majority of the world, in how they're handling some of the resolutions of the United Nations. What the long-term consequences are, I think other panelists have talked to, but it is the stance the United States is taking is definitely not in the majority, I would say, globally at the moment. I'd actually like to go to Ellen Nickmacher next, and then I will go to Abdullah, and then the two questions in the chat.
Hi there, it's Ellen Nickmeyer with the AP. I think I'm behind the curve on this topic, so if I'm asking people to repeat something that they've already gone into ad nauseum, I mean, just please excuse me and I can catch up later. But could Josh Paul and the others go into a little bit more detail on the situation with the supplement not requiring notification to Congress on foreign military finance? Do you mind going over that situation a little bit more? And whether there's precedent for that in the law on that.
Sure, this is Josh Paul responding to that. So for those who aren't tracking, what Ellen is referring to can be found on page 43 and 44 of the President's supplemental request in the foreign military financing section. It was also carried in the House version of the supplemental for Israel alone that passed the House a couple of weeks ago. And there is also language, although I'm not the expert on that, in the DoD section as well on some of that spending. And what this language would do is essentially exempt, now it depends on how you read it, the foreign military financing itself from notification to Congress, or any sales made under the foreign military financing or funded by that supplemental foreign military financing from being notified to Congress. The latter is certainly the intent, as I understood it, when the supplemental was advanced by the administration. I was involved in many discussions internal to the administration at the time on that language, where I tried to push back on it to no success. So this would be unprecedented in the sense of arms sales not being required to be notified to Congress, and I think would be deeply damaging because it would set a precedent where, if we can do this for Israel, why not for other partners? And I do understand that the congressional oversight committees have been very vocal in pushing back on this behind the scenes with the administration. When it comes to the grant assistance itself, Israel is unique amongst recipients of U.S. military grant assistance in that its foreign military financing, of which it is the largest recipient, it receives $3.3 billion a year under the current 10-year MOU, is considered, quote unquote, obligated upon appropriation. What that means is that once the Congress appropriates the funding, the department has essentially 30 days to get it out of the door into a interest-bearing account at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. And of course, therefore, Israel ends up getting more than was actually appropriated because it also gets the interest on the funding that is sitting there. For most countries in the world, before you can obligate, you have to notify Congress. There is a 15-day period. There are questions asked about how you're going to spend this. You have to justify it. If that had been the administration's intent in the context of this bill, to make the supplemental appropriation simply consistent with what is in the base bill, they could have just carried the language from the base bill, which says, you have 30 days to obligate. They didn't. They added this new language and fleshed out in the explanation, again on page 44 of the request, that this is specifically for Israel to expedite arms. It does not expedite arms. There are mechanisms available that do. This is redundant with those. So that's the background on that.
This is Sarah Yeager at Human Rights Watch. I also just want to say it doesn't, from a logical standpoint, one of the biggest speeches of Biden's presidency really was about supporting Israel and Ukraine, to the point of like, we are doing this because we are democracies, because we are fighting against authoritarian, all of these rationales that are core to his presidency. If the $14.3 billion that he wants to offer Israel is in service of that, there would be absolutely no reason not to notify Congress. There would be no reason to keep it under wraps. In fact, he would want to laud what the United States is offering Israel in defense of this, core pillar of what he believes is democracy and U.S. principle. So it doesn't make any rational sense.
So I'll just add in that you are starting to see, I would say, some congressional questioning of what the plan is for U.S. assistance to Israel. There was a statement by a number of Democratic members of the Senate last week that is in the resources. It's not opposing the provision of weapons, but is asking for pretty blunt questions about what is the plan here, which I think you are starting to see many more questions now about what is being transferred. As it was reported in the last 10 days, there was an earlier notification via direct commercial sales that really don't have much public transparency. So I think you're seeing greater and greater attention to this. Ellen, did we respond to your question?
I have one more point to add. Sorry, one more quick point to add. This is Josh again, and that was Jeff speaking right before me.
Thank you, Josh.
Yeah. Just that, if the Biden administration's rationale for this request is that, military assistance to Israel is urgent, the Biden administration has been arguing for 2 years now that military assistance to Ukraine is also urgent, and it is. So why make this request for Israel but not for Ukraine? That's it for me. Thank you.
You need to.
Right.
There you go.
Yeah. Thank you so much. This is Abdullah from MTV Lebanon News. Thank you for this opportunity. If I have a couple of questions to Mr. Josh, I'd like to ask actually. First of all, we in Lebanon, we always think that the U.S. foreign policy towards Lebanon is put in accordance to Israel and Syria sometimes, and sometimes Hezbollah. It's not for Lebanon. It's not an independent foreign policy towards Lebanon. So I'd like to know more about how's the foreign policy towards Lebanon, particularly when it comes to arms, is made in the U.S. one. Second question. Aside from what Paul said, that the U.S. policy in the Middle East didn't bring neither peace nor security to Palestine and Israel, don't you think that the deployment of Eisenhower's strike group, Carrier strike group, and other warships in Lebanon, in the region, go far than deterrence and might result in Lebanon entering into the war? We are very worried in Lebanon. Leader of Hezbollah has went to the media. He had speeches twice since the beginning of this conflict, and he always said that U.S. is responsible and U.S. should stop Israel, and as if he's escalating the scene into U.S. versus Hezbollah. But it's also obvious that he doesn't want to enter into a full-scale war. The situation in my country is very bad. Today, Israel attacked journalists on the southern borders. So how do you see that? What's the role of U.S. In this conflict now between Lebanon and Israel? And did you take Lebanon into consideration before deciding to resign from your post? As a Lebanese media here asking, we'd like to know more. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This is Josh replying to that. Thank you very much indeed, Abdullah, for those questions. I'll take them in reverse order. So I think there is a significant risk of escalation. And the longer this conflict goes on, the more people who die, the greater that risk is. I think such an escalation would be in no one's interest. And I deeply hope that it does not happen. I actually think that the deployment of the two carrier strike groups, as you refer to, was actually helpful in preventing that escalation. I think it has, led some of the parties involved to step back and think about, is this really now the time for the fights, that they want to have or don't want to have. So I think that has been helpful. And I think that the US is continuing to make efforts regionally and with partners in the region to contain this and to not see a further escalation. When it comes to US policy towards Lebanon, I would say two things. First of all, US foreign policy is a complicated process, right? It is not that the US speaks with one voice. And of course, so the administration, the president can pursue one set of goals, but it is up to Congress then to fund those goals. And of course, Congress can pass laws that implicate certain funding, that make certain declarations of policy. I think this administration really has been trying to help Lebanon. I think you see this, with funding in the past year, for example, directly for the Lebanese security forces, recognizing the catastrophic economic situation in the wake of the Beirut explosion, recognizing the challenges that Lebanon has faced as a result of the civil war in Syria, recognizing the challenges Lebanon has faced as a result of the tensions with Israel. I think the US genuinely is trying to do what it can to support a free and sovereign Lebanon, including a monopoly of force from the free and sovereign Lebanese government and its military forces. So I think that is very important. And I think that certainly everyone I worked with in the State Department really did care deeply about the situation in Lebanon, have been very concerned about it, and believe that any escalation would be devastating, sure, for Israel and for US interests, but also for the people of Lebanon. And that way is one of the reasons it is a top priority that there should not be any escalation.
And this is Sarah Yeager from Human Rights Watch. Just to jump on that, I want to make clear that our call to suspend arms transfers to Israel from the United States is conflict specific. So that is looking solely at Israel and Gaza and does not take into account Lebanon.
Any other panelists want to weigh in on, especially questions around Lebanon? Okay. There's two questions here from, go ahead, Amanda.
Sorry, Jeff, this is Amanda Classine. Just to say, as I mentioned in our findings, we have looked at the use of weapons of white phosphorus in southern Lebanon, and our arms embargo call is broader than Human Rights Watch's. So it is specific to the transfer to the government of Israel, to Hamas, or other Palestinian armed groups. So it would cover the arms that are being transferred for that purpose too.
Okay, thank you. I see two questions from Ahmad in the chat. I think I don't quite fully understand the first one. I think the question is, how is America relating to countries in the region that are supportive of Palestinian rights? And then the second one is the Kuwaiti support, how you evaluate Kuwaiti support. Ahmad, do you need to clarify my recap of those, or is that a fair way to characterize those two questions?
This is Josh. I'll just say very quickly. I mean, I think we've discussed, sort of the impact that this conflict has had on U.S. relations in the region, and it has had clearly a deleterious effect in terms of the relations between the U.S. and partners in the region, and also I think public perceptions of America in the region. When it comes to Kuwait, I am not an expert, but I believe that Kuwait, as it often does, has a constructive role to play here. It is, a very stable country. With strong relations with the Palestinian community, and so I think that there is a lot that Kuwait can do here, particularly on the humanitarian side. So I would thank the people of Kuwait for their consideration in that respect.
And Jeff, I think Abdullah has been waiting for.
No, Abdullah asked the questions from Lebanon. I think we've got Abdullah. I see one more here in the chat, and I won't even try to pronounce your name properly. Sorry. But this is actually a question from the Far East. Do human rights organizations plan to intensify their efforts if the situation deteriorates and the IDF continues to use US deployed weapons. This, I think, probably, I see no other hands or questions in the chat, so maybe we'll wrap up on this one. But if anybody else does have another one, please put them in. But I'll give it all the Amanda or May or Sarah if you want to jump in on this or not. Oh, and then we'll go to Harry Davies after this question. Sorry.
Yeah, just to say that Amnesty as a global movement had a weekend of action around a ceasefire call. We have over 1 million signatories to our petition calling for a ceasefire, and we're increasing our visibility around this issue within the United States. On Thursday, we had rap ads around Washington Post that were delivered to the White House calling for a ceasefire. We'll have a number of actions supporting that as well. As a membership organization, we have members that will be speaking to their members of Congress over the course of the next week, trying to really elevate our concerns about both the arms transfer and the need for a ceasefire. We'll continue to investigate violations. We have a number of incidents that are under investigation, and we're continuing to monitor. I think intensifying our efforts is all we're thinking about as the intensity of the conflict and the civilian harm only increases before our eyes.
This is May. We've had numerous actions thus far since October 7th. We've had weekly prayer meetings every Wednesday. We do a briefing opportunity every Thursday. Starting on the 20th, every Monday, we'll have community calls to Congress, where we'll be gathering and inviting people to call Congress together. And then during Advent, which is the month of December leading up to Christmas, we're calling on all of our constituents to, as an Advent spiritual and social practice, spend 3 minutes a day calling their members of Congress every single day, calling for a ceasefire, immediate and adequate humanitarian assistance, and release of hostages. You might have heard there's a campaign called 1 minute a day, and so we're saying 3 minutes a day to ask for those three things, during the Advent season. We're also having a prayer vigil at the White House on November 20th at 6 p.m. In Lafayette Park, calling for a ceasefire. And a number of our constituents and groups, many of them are Catholic, are starting to engage in civil disobedience to call attention to the war and also to call for a ceasefire.
Right. And I think you'll see there will be more reports coming out that are in the works as evidence is coming along. Okay. Yeah. You look like you're good now. Go ahead. Try now. No. Maybe you can put it in the chat, Harry. Patricia asked a question about, are we seeing signs of advocacy or affecting the views of members of Congress?
I think we are. This is Sarah Yeager from Human Rights Watch. As Jeff mentioned, there was a letter that went from the majority of the Democratic caucus questioning the objectives of the U.S. administration to then question the objectives of Israel in conducting this military operation. I think that that's a really important thing. We may also see some joint resolutions of disapproval coming for the, what's called the SPICE. I can't remember what exactly it's called. SPICE something.
Yeah, spice bomb kits, basically.
The spice bomb kits. Yeah. So this is a sale to, or a arms transfer to Israel that was notified to Congress. And I suspect we're going to see some joint resolutions of disapproval, which is basically the way that Congress can say, no, we don't agree with that. Now, I don't think they're actually going to work, but symbolically, I think that that's pretty important and has probably, I don't know if it's ever been done for Israel.
This is Josh. Yes, so it's been done once before, which was in 2021, in May, during the Israeli operation against Gaza, then when the US notified, actually coincidentally, a precision-guided munition sale to Israel, sorry. And then maybe this is, Josh, I'll just add in terms of the question on are the advocacy efforts affecting the views of members of Congress? I would agree with Sarah. I think there is a slight shift. I think that shift is probably much more pronounced behind closed doors. And, as with the administration's decisions on arms transfers, when it comes to Congress's decisions on votes, actions speak louder than words. So I think we need to still see that.
And there's a question in the chat from Harry on the timing of the JDAM transfer recently announced. seems to have been approved much earlier. Does anybody have any comment on that? I think we're talking about the spice kits, not the JDAMs, but
This is Josh. Well, that would be my question. I haven't seen a recently announced JDAM transfer. So I think we're talking about the spice kits, if Harry can confirm that. You're right. Yes. So the spice kits. Yes, you're correct. This is not a request that came in after October 7th. This predates October 7th. The spice kit specifically.
I think we'll wrap up. Abdullah, you had another question in the chat here. But Harry, if you have another one, please let us know about the president's approach to the two-state solution. I wonder if anybody has a comment on that.
Well, I think this is Sarah Yeager from Human Rights Watch. There's been a lot of talk about the day after, which is really difficult to talk about in this moment when so many people are suffering. However, I do think that the day after Israel's military operations probably should have been considered well before this moment. In fact, on the 8th of October would have been a good time to be considering what that looks like, because military operations at this moment and for the past few weeks have a very dramatic impact on what the day after looks like for Palestinians and for Israelis. And so I think, the devastation that we're seeing, if Gaza is uninhabitable, these are not good preconditions for getting to a state of peace, security, and a two-state solution.
And I would just follow up. This is Amanda Classy, and I would just follow up that we've focused a lot today on Gaza, but there's of course concerns related to rising violence in West Bank, and this is a part of that conversation as well. We have to really assess the risk of gross violations of human rights that we're investigating, and hopefully we'll have information to share. But this is part of that context and the thinking about the day after. It's not just what's happening right now in the Gaza Strip, but also thinking about turning attention to and trying to reduce the violence that's happening in West Bank as well.
I want to thank everyone, all the panelists, for their insights and for sharing their work. We know this is a very difficult time. Obviously, thank all the reporters who have also joined in. As a reminder, please quote the individuals themselves. They are not responsible for what each other has said and not necessarily endorse what each other has said, nor does this forum on the arms trade, but we wanted to create this space. We will follow up shortly with the audio recording as well as the resources that were shared in this call. Thank you so much for your attention in this difficult time.